Well, the same thing happens year in, year out, particularly during the summer months as we're in. Plant the seed, plow the field, grow the grain, take the yield. Some years will be better than others will. Most will give about the same. The farmer sows the field, dropping each seed where it is most likely to grow. Just as a shepherd knows his sheep, the farmer too knows his field. The farmer knows where to sow and where not to sow. And every farmer knows, don't put the seed by the road. The birds will get them fast. Don't put the seed in the rocks. They just won't last. And don't put the seed in the thorns. They're a pain in the fingers, right? Pain in the fingers. That's what it was. Soil is by and large predictable. It's the confluence of minerals and organic matter, gases, liquids, a myriad of organisms. Soil develops over many, many years, breaking down and building up until it's a habitable place to raise a seed into a stalk and then to bear fruit. However, as each year comes and goes, there's nothing that changes any slower than dirt. Unless there's a flood or a drought or a big bag of 10-10-10, the soil pretty much stays the same. And so there is the soil where plants grow well, and then there's that plain old dirt where it does not. Hold on to the fertile soil at all costs. It's the bedrock of what the farmer needs to eat from. Guard it, protect it, keep invaders away from it, but do not let the excellent soil go. All the rest, that infertile dirt, it's meh. Sure, a few bits might grow here and there, mixed in with the rest, but really it's just not worth it. Not enough of the good for too much time spent. There are better things to do. No farmer worth his weight in grain pays attention to that other dirt. There's just no point. So when it comes to sowing crops, farmers are conscientious. A year ago, I had a chance to visit with some real farmers. We have a family reunion that occurs every 5 years. This was actually the 6th. We delayed it a year with COVID. And they live in southeastern Iowa. And two of my mother's cousins farm corn and soy in that area. That side of the family lives on 1,200 acres of the thickest, darkest, most fertile soil that Iowa has to offer. And even at 1,200 acres, by today's standards, it's a relatively modest farm. When we're there, we get a chance to go on a hay ride pulled by a tractor, the small tractor, and if we're lucky, we get to get in the big tractor where my mother's cousin will drive the kids kind of around the central part of the farm, and no visit is complete without a chance to climb up a ladder into the big cab of their combine, which is probably about the size of this room. It's huge. My cousin tells me that finding good soil is actually not all that difficult these days because they have GPS and satellite weather data and even automatic controls in the tractors so that planting in the right places can almost be as simple as the push of a button. It's hard to believe how far our modern agricultural farming practices have come. But remember, those earliest farmers, they dropped seed while walking along in rows instead of big injecting plows that rolled behind a massive John Deere. A yoke was used to join beasts of burden attached to a plow to turn over the soil covering the seeds. Farmers had no use of scattering seed anywhere but the places that it was good enough to grow. Only those places. A good farmer had better things to do than to go after just a few little spindly strands of wheat. Tending a field was certainly a tried and true practice taught from father to son, season after season, year after year. And before our modern sense of agricultural science, most years in Jesus' time reliably yielded about 7 times the worth of the seed. In perfect conditions, on those really great years, that number could in fact increase to 10. But as predictable as the seasons change, inevitably grows the good soil, or grows, the seed grows well in the good soil of the field. Now, in this morning's parable, those listening to Jesus knew all too well what it took to plant a field. So instead of telling them about something that they knew very, very well, Jesus doesn't tell them about how to plant. Jesus tells them instead about a really funny kind of farmer. The sower in this parable was, by all accounts, a complete klutz, especially given the agricultural practices of that time. He scatters his grain all over the place. He drops it on the road. He drops it in the rocks. He even drops it over where the thorns are going to grow. He's wasting his seed, scattering it everywhere, even and especially even in those places that it has no business going in the first place. And so the question is, why? For those Jesus would have been speaking to hear a farmer doing this, the question on their minds is why? Why plant the sections of the field that would not grow? All the predictable things happen in the parable. The birds come and eat the seed off the road. They knew that was going to happen. The seed that gets on the rocks, well, it starts, but then it keels over, not having any depth. They would have known that. The seed in the thorny parts, well, it starts well too, but then gets choked off as the thorns come up. But something else also happens. In this parable, as Jesus says it, other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain. Not just 7-fold in this case, but 100, and some 60, and some 30. That's a lot of return. Because this farmer not only sowed his seeds in the likely parts of the field, but in the unlikely parts as well, his yield was more than 10 times what any other well-meaning farmer would have grown. That's a lot of yield. Now, when reading this passage, pastors like me will frequently focus on the different types of soil as a warning to walk that straight and narrow path of the Christian life. You may have heard this sermon before. Faith could be like that seed that's fallen on the hard path, shallow, vulnerable, exposed, unable to be rooted before the threats of uncertainty in my life. Come like the birds and snatch my faith away. Or there are those times when faith lies on the rocky soil. Well, to that small, little, insignificant seed of faith, rocks are a big, insurmountable boulder in the way of their progress. They're unable to overcome it. And I, too, look around to see what are those stones of doubt that are in my way, preventing my roots from growing. And then, of course, there are those seeds dropped in the thorns in the beginning. They're not all that different than the seeds dropped in the good soil. But even with the best of starts, faith becomes overoccupied with concern. And as Jesus says, the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. Jesus is clear. Seeds of faith can get into all kinds of trouble. There are hard, dry roads, jagged rocks, and rough terrain, even deceptively promising starts that become choked off by the thorns of the world. But despite reading this parable as a guide to watch out for those many pitfalls to avoid, I take comfort in remembering that this parable is not about the soil. Because this parable is about the sower. Jesus tells the story of an extravagant farmer. The farmer puts his seeds where others do not. This farmer goes the extra mile to find every single nook and cranny that will spring up life, no matter the circumstances. This farmer sows with a willingness to give it all, expecting the yield to flourish in a way that is more extraordinary than anyone has ever seen. The generosity of the Father to grow his seeds in the good soil means that the Father goes to remarkable lengths, allowing you and me to produce the fruits of faith. And so in response, I take heart in this assurance of seeing that everything that God does is the work of bringing each seed to full flower. So where are these places of good soil for God's fruit to thrive? Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk, seemingly left the world to find his quest, or in a quest to find God among the solitude and the rigors of monastic life, living in a monastery. And then one day he leaves the monastery and he runs into the local town to do some errands. All the mundane stuff that you and I do. And he had an epiphany as people were going about around the town doing their errands and chores as well. None of them were particularly holy in their rushing around, but he later writes that he felt suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that he loved all of those people. Because he realized that they were mine and that I was theirs. That we couldn't be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like for him waking up from a dream of separateness. I hope that there are days, even in my mundane errands, that I can love like that. Which makes me also wonder where else this good soil might be uncovered. Well, a notable pastor named Barbara Brown Taylor recalls passing a little country church. The church had a sign out front that said, "Come on in, God's been waiting for you here." And in reflection, she ponders, it's hard to think that anyone truly believes that anymore. If God is waiting anywhere, then isn't God waiting everywhere? Now, Reverend Brown Taylor will wholeheartedly affirm that the church is where people go to to learn the rituals and the stories and the songs and the ways of being together that help them recognize the divine presence wherever they go. However, understanding that the church building is the only place of good soil, the only place in this world deserving of God's care, well, that's just not true. Inevitably, I'll hear the question asked a number of different ways among our 62 congregations as I come into this role. And the question goes something like this: how are we going to get people to come back into the church? Well, for some of them, that may be as easy as trying to tell a little seed to literally jump from its rocky habitat into fertile soil. For you and for me, I'll admit that I don't have many answers when it comes to being the same church today that we were a couple of years ago, especially as we come out of this maybe once in a generational time of a pandemic. But I do have faith in a God who cultivates relationship. God grows it from the ground up. God brings all things and all people closer to God and to each other. The good news in this morning's parable tells us that this sower abundantly, embarrassingly even, sows seeds in every place, every terrain, every condition, because that sower knows that some of those seeds will take hold and grow. Maybe instead of asking, how can we get those who are outside to come inside, it seems to me that God's plan uses those in the church, you and me included, to reach out and to tend new seeds of faith. Especially in those places where we naturally would not expect these seeds to grow. At least, not yet. When the harvest comes, remember this sower, tending to the stalk and to the fruit, carefully plucking out the thorns, shooing away the birds wherever the yield is found. And together, you and I in ministry will stumble upon the places where that holy sower is already spreading seeds of faith. With the hope of God's providence, we will encourage every seed of faith to grow. So look everywhere for the seeds in the field, not just in the likely places, the expected places where those seeds grow, but everywhere. And as the season continues, there will be a chance to stand in awe, seeing what is seemingly impossible become possible. Rejoicing in the overflowing grace of God and joining the harvest to celebrate the good fruit coming home. Thanks be to God, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.